Anglo-Saxon Boy Chapter 10 A Lone Rider. Harvest time came and went, and summer passed into autumn, the days growing shorter and the nights cooler. Magnus still had no word from his father, and worry about what was happening in the north began to gnaw away at him. He had learned to ignore most of the rumours that always buzzed around King Edward's court. But there was constant talk of Tostig now. And even if Magnus only believed a tiny part of what he had heard, things were clearly getting worse for his uncle. Magnus tried not to think about it, concentrating on being a good troop leader instead. He had other distractions, chief among them the chance to see members of the wider Godwin clan. His uncles Gurth and Leofwine arrived on Thorney a few days after his brothers. They were big, broad-shouldered, fair-haired men with hard Godwin faces and loud voices, more like Tostig than his father. They talked a lot and drank even more, although they never seemed to get drunk. Grandmother Gertha lived in London, and when she discovered that so many of her descendants were on Thorney Island, she demanded they visit her. Magnus and Hakon and his brothers and uncles rode there one chilly morning, entering at the great gate in the western wall. London had wide streets and bustling crowds, and Magnus thought it was far more impressive than York. Grandmother Gertha's house was in the heart of the city. She was waiting for them in the enormous main room, and Magnus was pleased to see that she was the same as ever, tall and striking, her face framed by stone-grey hair, her cheekbones like the blades of axes, her eyes like shards of blue ice. She barked orders in Danish at her servants, who were clearly terrified of her. "When are you going to learn to speak English, grandmother?" Magnus said in Danish, smiling at her. His grandmother had lived in England most of her life, more than 50 winters all told, and yet she always refused to speak the language of the Saxons, although everybody knew that she could understand it very well. "English is for slaves and dogs," she said, airily dismissing it with a wave of her hand. "In our family we speak Danish, the tongue of warriors and kings. Now, I want to hear everybody's news, and it had better be interesting. You first, Gurth." "Well, I don't know where to start," said Gurth. "So much has happened." Both Gurth and Leofwine did their best, but their news was the usual stuff of families: new babies, sicknesses suffered and recovered from, the death of an old servant she might have remembered. Godwin and Edmund talked about themselves, briefly mentioned their sisters. Gertha had a soft spot for her namesake, but they soon dried up. Magnus could see that his grandmother wasn't impressed. "I hope you've got something more exciting to tell me, Magnus," she said. "He should have," said Edmund. "He went to see Uncle Tostig in York." "Did he now?" said Gertha. "So what kind of mess has Tostig got himself into this time? He's my handsomest son, but he's also the most rash and headstrong." Once again, Magnus found himself at the centre of the circles of faces, his family staring, waiting for him to start talking. It would have been easy in the past, but he knew his father would want him to be careful what he said, even to those he was related to by blood. So he repeated what he had told his brothers about Edwin and Morcar, and about the people not paying their taxes. But he hadn't told Godwin and Edmund how bad things were in the north, and he didn't go into any more detail now. "He's being modest, grandmother," said Godwin, punching him in the shoulder. "Tell her about the fight you got into, Magnus, and how you killed the man." "I only did what I was supposed to," said Magnus, his cheeks burning. "I'd probably be dead if it wasn't for Hakon," he said, glancing at the housecarl, who gave him the usual shrug. "And I'm sure there's nothing to worry about, grandmother," Magnus added. "My father has gone north to sort things out." "That's good," said his grandmother. "I asked Tostig's wife to visit me when he first sent her to the king, and she did nothing but cry and upset those boys of hers, so I won't have her here anymore. She should have shown more backbone and stayed with her husband anyway. I've got good mind to pack her off back to where she came from. Flanders, wasn't it? Why, she could barely speak Danish at all." "She was probably crying because you frightened her half to death, mother," said Leofwine, grinning. "You don't know how fierce you are." "Oh, I think I do," she said and scowled. "It's why I've survived this long." They laughed, and she gave them a wintry smile. "Tell me, grandmother, where is my Aunt Edith?" "The Queen," said Magnus. "Shouldn't she be here with the king?" "Don't talk to me about her," said Gertha, her smile vanishing. "She spends most of her time in some dreadful abbey miles from here. I can't blame her for not wanting to be with Edward. But she's letting the family down with all that praying. I don't know why she bothers. It didn't turn her husband into the kind of man who could give her sons, did it? Still, one day, soon, this land might have a proper king again." "It sounds as if you know who that'll be," said Magnus, still laughing. "Well, it should be your father, of course," she said. "In fact, I can't understand why Harold doesn't just cut Edward's scrawny throat and be done with it. We all know it would be a mercy for the sickly old fool, and for the rest of us as well." "Hush, grandmother, you shouldn't say such things." Magnus glanced round, but there were no servants in the room with them. His uncles and brothers were sniggering, and there was a faint smile on Hakon's lips too. Magnus rolled his eyes, as if to say, "Don't listen, she's only trying to shock." But then he realised his grandmother was frowning and staring at him with those icy blue eyes. "Why not?" she snapped. "There are plenty of people who agree with me." Magnus stopped smiling. It was clear that she had meant every word. A few days later, Gurth and Leofwine left Thorney, taking Godwin and Edmund with them. The weather turned blustery and cold, and one morning when Magnus arrived for duty on the bridge, the muddy ruts in front of the gate glittered with a silvery frost. Hakon ordered men to fetch braziers from the stores, and they soon had fires going. After a while they heard hoofbeats, and Magnus saw a lone rider fast approaching the gate. Magnus stepped forward and held his hand up. The rider brutally reined in his horse. It reared upwards, its eyes wild, then crashed its hooves to the ground. Both man and beast were panting heavily, the man's face deathly pale, his cloak and tunic splattered with mud, his mount covered in a sheen of sweat. "Halt in the name of the king," said Magnus. "Who comes to Thorney?" "A messenger, and I bring evil news from the north," the man replied. Magnus felt his blood go cold. He recognised the man. "You're one of my Uncle Tostig's men, aren't you?" he said. "What has happened?" "My message is for the ears of the king alone. Will you let me pass?" The messenger stared down at him, his face hard, and Magnus could see there was no point in trying to make him talk. So he stepped aside, and the messenger spurred his horse through the gate and then galloped away towards the king's hall. "Take over here, Hakon," said Magnus. "I need to find out what's going on." Magnus ran after the messenger, his mind churning with dark thoughts, fears for his uncle, and for his father too. At the hall, two of the housecarls on door duty were struggling to bring the messenger's horse under control as it reared and snorted, its saddle now empty. Magnus hurried inside and pushed past anyone who got in his way, ignoring their curses. King Edward was sitting on his throne, the messenger kneeling before him. As usual, there were several priests near the throne too. Among them, one Magnus had come to know. Stigand, Archbishop of Canterbury. He was an old man, older even than Edward, his hair white and his face wrinkled. But he stood tall and straight-backed in his rich embroidered robes, and his eyes glittered with sharpness. "Ah, you're the Godwin boy, who went to see poor Tostig, aren't you?" said the king, turning to Magnus. "You better hear what this messenger has to say." "Are you sure, my lord?" said the messenger. The king nodded, and the messenger turned to Magnus. "Edwin attacked York, and many of Lord Tostig's men went over to him. The people of the city rose against Tostig too, and slaughtered most of the rest." "What about Tostig?" said Magnus. "Did he get away?" "I don't know. He was still in the palace when he sent me south." Magnus turned and strode out of the hall, his fists clenched.